At our 4th of July barbecue in the quiet town of Maple Creek, Vermont, I felt a true sense of fear for my daughter, Emily, for the first time. The air was thick with the scent of charcoal and freshly cut grass, but all I could focus on was the fragile figure huddled in a lawn chair. She was a shadow of her former self, painfully thin, her bones sharp beneath a summer dress that hung on her like a drape. Her eyes, once a vibrant blue, were dull, and her skin had a grayish tint that no amount of sunshine could warm. Her husband, Ethan, never left her side, constantly hovering, a tall glass of a murky green smoothie always in his hand for her. He claimed it was a special blend of superfoods, the key to her health, the only thing her delicate system could handle. What unsettled me, however, was the way my own wife, Susan, looked at Emily. There was pity in her gaze, but it was sharpened by a strange irritation. They had been clashing for months over Emily's failing health, with Susan openly disapproving of Ethan's modern methods. That evening, as I watched Ethan coax another sip of that green concoction into our daughter, a terrible thought began to form, a suspicion that my wife's jealousy of their bond had finally crossed a dangerous line. The weeks following the barbecue were a descent into a nightmare. The vibrant Vermont summer, with its lush greens and brilliant blue skies, felt like a mocking backdrop to the decay happening within our daughter. Emily's condition worsened with an alarming speed that defied all of Ethan's optimistic assurances. It was no longer just a matter of her being thin. A tremor had developed in her hands, making it difficult for her to hold a fork. She began losing her hair, not in dramatic clumps, but in a slow, heartbreaking thinning that she tried to hide by wearing hats and scarves. Worst of all was the confusion. She would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, staring into the distance with a vacant look that terrified me. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I had stopped by their house to find Emily standing in the middle of the living room, crying silently. She couldn't remember how to use the coffee machine, a device she had operated daily for years. Ethan was right there, of course, patting her shoulder and reaching for the blender. "It's all right, my love," he cooed, his voice a smooth balm of poison. "The toxins are just leaving your body. We need another smoothie to help the process along." That was it. I saw red. I told him, in a tone that left no room for argument, that I was taking her to see Dr. Evans, our family physician for over 20 years. Ethan protested, his calm facade cracking slightly. He argued that traditional medicine would only pump her full of chemicals, undoing all his hard work. But when I looked at my daughter's terrified, confused eyes, his words were nothing but static. The drive to the clinic was tense. Emily was quiet, listless in the passenger seat, while I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Dr. Evans saw us immediately. He took one look at Emily's pale face, her thinning hair, and the slight tremble in her hands, and his usual jovial expression vanished, replaced by a mask of grave concern. He was gentle with her, asking questions about her diet, her energy levels, her symptoms. Ethan, who had insisted on following us there, answered for her most of the time, spinning a narrative of detoxification and holistic healing. Dr. Evans listened patiently, his gaze flickering between Ethan's earnest face and Emily's exhausted one. Then he turned to me. "I need to run some comprehensive blood panels, Mark. And a toxicology screen. I want you to wait here. I'll take Emily back myself." The wait was agonizing. An hour stretched into 2. I paced the small, beige-carpeted waiting room, the sanitized air feeling suffocating. Ethan sat perfectly still, scrolling through his phone, a picture of calm that now seemed utterly reptilian to me. Finally, the door to the inner offices opened, but it was only Dr. Evans. He looked older than he had just a few hours before. "Mark," he said, his voice low and heavy. "Can you come back to my office? A nurse is sitting with Emily." My heart hammered against my ribs as I followed him down the hall. The office was the same as it had always been, filled with medical books and framed photos of his grandchildren, but today it felt like a courtroom. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk, and looked me directly in the eye. His voice was barely a whisper, but each word was a hammer blow. "Mark, this isn't a virus. It's not an autoimmune disorder or a nutritional deficiency." He took a deep breath. "It's thallium poisoning. Slow and systematic." The room tilted. Thallium. The word sounded alien, chemical, insidious. It was a poison, I knew that much. A rat poison. My mind reeled, refusing to accept it. Then, like a series of flashbulbs exploding in my brain, everything clicked into a horrifying, distorted picture. Susan. Her constant complaints about Ethan. Her frustration that Emily wouldn't listen to her. The little bags of herbal remedies she kept trying to give Emily, insisting they would counteract whatever sludge Ethan was feeding her. "She looks at him like he's a god," Susan had seethed just a month ago. "She's forgotten who her family is." At the time, I'd dismissed it as the hurt feelings of a mother being pushed aside. Now, in the sterile silence of this office, it sounded like a motive. The irritation I had seen in her eyes at the barbecue wasn't frustration, it was malice. Her pity wasn't for Emily's illness, but for her own impending success. The envy had become a poison. A volcanic rage, cold and absolute, washed over me. I don't remember thanking Dr. Evans or the drive home. All I remember is the certainty hardening in my gut. I walked into the home Susan and I had built together for 30 years, and I saw her standing in the kitchen, humming as she arranged flowers in a vase. The domestic tranquility of the scene was so obscene it made me physically sick. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice a low growl I didn't recognize. She turned, a smile on her face that faltered when she saw my expression. "Mark? What is it? Is Emily all right?" "Don't you dare say her name," I snarled, advancing on her. "You were so jealous, weren't you? So angry that she chose him over you, that she wouldn't take your little potions and teas." Her face went pale with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Thallium, Susan. The doctor found thallium in her blood. A poison. You did this. You poisoned our daughter because you couldn't stand to see her happy with someone else." The fight that followed was apocalyptic. It was a storm of accusation and denial, of 30 years of shared memories being twisted and weaponized. Her pleas of innocence, her frantic, tear-filled denials, sounded like lies to my ears. Her confusion seemed like a performance. Every time she said she was just trying to help, I pictured her stirring a tasteless powder into a drink, her face contorted with resentment. The foundation of our life together crumbled into dust in the space of a single hour. The next morning, the house was silent and cold. I found her sitting on the edge of our bed, her suitcases packed. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed but her expression resolute. "I didn't do this, Mark." I was deaf to her words, my heart encased in ice. "Get out," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "Get out of my house." I didn't watch her leave. I just stood in the living room, listening to the front door open and click shut, severing 30 years of my life. In my grief and rage, I was so certain of her guilt, I never once stopped to consider that I was throwing away the only person who had been trying to tell me the truth all along. The days after I threw Susan out were the emptiest of my life. The house, once a home filled with the comfortable noise of a 30-year partnership, became a cavern of silence. Her absence was a physical presence. I'd see her favorite mug by the sink and feel a pang of something I refused to name. The scent of her shampoo lingered in the bathroom. I systematically went through the house and packed away her things, not out of spite, but because every photograph, every book, every jacket slung over a chair was a screaming accusation. I was convinced I had done the right thing, the only thing a father could do to protect his child. I told myself the hollowness in my chest was the price of that protection. I moved Emily into our guest room. Ethan, to my surprise, agreed readily. Of course, he'd said, his expression one of deep sympathy for my marital strife. She needs her father right now. We all need to be strong for her. He would visit every day, always with a freshly blended container of the green smoothie. He managed her diet with an iron fist, politely turning away the chicken soup I made or the toast I offered. Her system is too compromised for solids, Mark. We have to stick to the protocol. I saw it as dedication. I saw him as a devoted husband, stepping in to care for my daughter where her own mother had failed so monstrously. Yet, Emily wasn't getting better. The tremors were less frequent, but the fog of confusion remained, and she slept for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. A week after Susan left, a thick manila envelope appeared in our mailbox. It was addressed to me in her familiar, elegant script. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened. I assumed it was a letter from a lawyer, or perhaps one last, desperate plea. For 2 days, it sat on the kitchen counter, a silent, rectangular reproach. Finally, late one night when the house was still and my own resolve was at its lowest, I tore it open. It wasn't a letter from a lawyer. Inside was a stack of documents, held together by a simple paperclip. On top was a handwritten note. My hands trembled as I read the words she had written. I was harsh, but I was scared for her. Look at him, Mark. Only him. Beneath the note was the proof. First, there were pharmacy receipts from the last 6 months. I scanned the itemized lists, my blood running cold. Vitamin B12. Iron supplements. High-potency vitamin D, electrolyte powders. Everything on the receipts was exactly what a concerned person would buy for someone who was weak and malnourished. There were no strange herbs, no unregulated tinctures, nothing that could possibly be a poison. Then I saw the printouts of the text messages she had sent to Emily. My breath caught in my throat as I read them, the black and white text forming a narrative of a mother's frantic, ignored desperation. Susan, Emily, you have to ask him what's in those smoothies. Superfoods isn't an answer. Susan, you look thinner every time I see you. This isn't a cleanse, honey, this is starvation. Susan, why won't you let me take you to a real doctor? This man is isolating you. Can't you see that? Susan, he threw out the casserole I brought you. He said it had too much sodium. Emily, please, baby, listen to me. This isn't normal. This isn't love. My certainty, the bedrock of rage on which I had demolished my life, didn't just crumble, it was obliterated. It felt like the floor had fallen away, plunging me into an icy abyss of my own making. Her words, which I had twisted into the ravings of a jealous shrew, were now revealed for what they were, warnings. The pure, terrified warnings of a mother watching her child slip away. Look at him, Mark. Only him. The command echoed in my head, and suddenly, my memories of the past few months began to recontextualize, shifting and rearranging themselves into a new, monstrous shape. I remembered Ethan at the barbecue, his hand always on Emily's arm, steering her away from the food table. I remembered him speaking for her, answering questions directed at her with a proprietary air. Emily finds it hard to make decisions when she's detoxing, he'd say with a smile. And the smoothies. Always the smoothies. Prepared by him, and only by him, in his high-powered blender that he'd brought with him when they moved in. He never made one for anyone else. He never let anyone else taste it. He controlled every single calorie that went into her body. The image of him standing over the blender, calmly pushing vegetables into the vortex, transformed in my mind from an act of care to something clinical and sinister. I had seen dedication, but I had been blind. It wasn't dedication. It was control. It was a siege. And I, in my blind fury, had banished the only person who had tried to sound the alarm. I had thrown out the lookout and personally invited the enemy into the fortress. The weight of my mistake was suffocating. It was a physical pressure in my chest, a sickness in my stomach. For a few hours, I was paralyzed by shame and regret. But then I looked at the closed door of the guest room, where my daughter was sleeping her unnaturally deep sleep, and a new feeling took over, a cold, focused dread. The poison wasn't gone. The source of the poison was still coming into my house every single day, smiling, and handing my daughter a glass of it. With Susan's documents clutched in my hand, I drove to the Maple Creek police station. The air inside was stale, smelling of coffee and disinfectant. I asked to speak to a detective, and a woman with tired, intelligent eyes introduced herself as Detective Miller. She led me to a small, cluttered office and listened patiently as the whole sordid story spilled out of me. I told her about Emily's illness, the doctor's diagnosis, and, my voice cracking with shame, my monstrous accusation against my wife. I handed her the envelope. "My wife sent me this," I said, my voice hoarse. I think I've made a terrible mistake. I think it's him." Detective Miller looked at me, her expression unreadable. I could see the skepticism in her eyes, the weariness of someone used to the messy recriminations of domestic disputes. But then she began to read. She read the note. She examined the receipts. She spread the printouts of the text messages across her desk. I watched as her professional detachment slowly gave way to a focused intensity. She read one of Susan's texts aloud, quietly, as if to herself. "This isn't love." She looked up at me, and the skepticism was gone. In its place was a sharp, chilling alertness. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice now clipped and serious. "Tell me everything you know about your son-in-law." Detective Miller's final words hung in the air of her small office, shifting the entire axis of my world. This was no longer a domestic tragedy born of jealousy and misunderstanding. It was a criminal investigation. She told me to go home and, for the love of God, to act normal. It was the hardest thing she could have asked me to do. "We have nothing to hold him on yet," she explained, her voice firm. "Right now, all we have are suspicions and a tragic coincidence. If he senses anything is wrong, he might disappear. Or worse, he might accelerate his plans. You are our only window into his life with Emily. Do not let him know you've been here. Do not challenge him. Just watch, and wait for my call." Walking back into my house was like entering a cage with a predator I hadn't known was there. The familiar rooms felt alien, menacing. The next day, Ethan arrived at his usual time, a cheerful smile on his face and a large, insulated flask in his hand. My skin crawled. Every friendly word, every concerned inquiry about Emily's sleep, was a note in a symphony of horror. I had to force myself to breathe normally as I watched him pour the thick, green liquid into a glass and carry it into the guest room where my daughter was waiting. I could hear his soothing voice through the door, the gentle murmur of a man administering poison to his wife. My hands clenched into fists in my pockets, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to storm in there, to smash the glass from his hand, to throttle the life out of him. But Miller's warning echoed in my ears, and I stood frozen in the hallway, a powerless, pretending fool, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure terror. The call came 36 hours later, 36 hours of agonizing, gut-wrenching performance. "Mark," Detective Miller's voice was clipped, "all business. Can you come down to the station? There's something you need to see." I drove with a sense of grim purpose, the fog of my grief and shame replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Miller was waiting for me, and she led me not to her office, but to a small, windowless conference room. A file folder lay on the table between two styrofoam cups of coffee. She didn't waste any time. "We started digging into Ethan Grant's past," she began. Opening the folder. "On the surface, he's a ghost. He moved to Vermont 4 years ago, no family to speak of, no real connections. But he wasn't a ghost before that. He lived in Portland, Oregon. And he was married." She slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Ethan, younger and smiling, with his arm around a woman with a bright, infectious laugh and fiery red hair. She was vibrant, full of life. "That's Jessica Cole," Miller said softly. "Ethan's first wife. She died 3 years ago." My blood turned to ice. "How did she die?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Miller's eyes met mine, and they were filled with a grim certainty. The official cause of death was a rare and aggressive neurological disorder. The attending physician noted it presented with atypical symptoms that were difficult to diagnose. She pulled a sheet of paper from the file. It was a copy of a medical report. She turned it to face me and pointed a finger at a block of text. "Here are the primary symptoms, documented over the last 6 months of her life: progressive hair loss, chronic fatigue, nausea, peripheral neuropathy, and severe cognitive confusion." It was a perfect, horrifying echo. She was describing Emily. I felt the air leave my lungs, my vision swimming as I stared at the clinical, black and white text that described the same death sentence my own daughter was currently living. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a blueprint. It was a dress rehearsal for what was happening in my home right now. "I spoke with Jessica's sister this morning," Miller continued, her tone low and even. "She never trusted Ethan. She said he isolated Jessica from her family, took over every aspect of her life, especially her diet. He had her on a regimen of special, health smoothies to flush out the toxins he claimed were making her sick." I finally understood. Susan's warnings, Jessica's sister's suspicions, they were two sides of the same coin, two women who had been pushed away by a charismatic monster while they tried desperately to save someone they loved. And I had been on the wrong side. I had aided the monster. "There's more," Miller said, pulling out another document. "Jessica Cole wasn't just his wife. She was a genius. She founded a highly successful IT security firm called Cole Innovations. She built it from the ground up." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle in the silent room. "When she died, her will named her devoted husband, Ethan, as the sole beneficiary. He inherited her entire estate, including a company valued at over $8 million. The final piece clicked into place, revealing the full, breathtaking evil of his design. This wasn't about a need for control or a twisted form of affection. It was a cold, calculated business model. Find a successful, trusting woman. Isolate her. Slowly poison her under the guise of care, making her symptoms mimic a rare disease. Play the part of the grieving, devoted husband. Inherit everything. And then, move on to the next target. Emily wasn't just his wife, she was his next acquisition. The room felt small, the air thick and unbreathable. My terrible mistake had done more than cost me my wife, it had nearly cost my daughter her life. The fight was no longer just to save Emily from a mysterious illness. It was to save her from a predator who had perfected the art of turning love into a murder weapon. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a hunt. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it could tear me apart. "How do we stop him?" Detective Miller's gaze was like granite. "He's done this before, Mark. And he'll do it again unless we stop him. We need evidence that will put him away for life. We need to catch him in the act." The first step was the most perilous, getting Emily away from him. A direct intervention was too risky. Ethan would play the part of the concerned husband whose wife was being taken from him, and he would know we were onto him. The plan Miller devised was one of subtle misdirection. With the reluctant but necessary help of Dr. Evans, an official-looking letter was drafted. It was a referral to a prestigious neurological clinic in Burlington, a facility specializing in rare, degenerative disorders. The letter detailed a new, experimental treatment program that was Emily's only hope. In reality, the clinic was the spare bedroom of her childhood friend, Chloe, a registered nurse who understood the gravity of the situation. Presenting the plan to Ethan was one of the most difficult performances of my life. I sat with him at my kitchen table, the forged letter in my trembling hands, and explained that Dr. Evans had pulled some strings. I played the part of the desperate father, willing to try anything. Ethan's reaction was exactly what we had anticipated. His jaw tightened, and a flicker of something cold and possessive flashed in his eyes before being replaced by a mask of deep concern. "Mark, I understand your fear," he said, his voice a smooth caress of reason. "But these clinics, they'll just fill her with invasive chemicals. It will undo all the progress we've made. The detoxification is working. Her body just needs more time." "We don't have more time, Ethan," I snapped, letting real fear fuel my performance. "Dr. Evans says this is our last shot. If you prevent her from going, and she gets worse, I will never forgive you. It will be on you." He saw the corner he was backed into. To deny her this life-saving treatment would look monstrous to any outside observer. He couldn't risk it. After a long, tense silence, he finally relented with a sigh of magnanimous defeat. "Of course, Mark. If you think it's for the best. Anything for Emily." The next day, we moved her. She was listless and confused, barely registering the change as I packed a small bag for her. Ethan hovered, a picture of sorrowful concern, placing a large, sealed container of his green smoothie into the bag. "For the drive," he said. "She can't miss a dose." I wanted to vomit. At Chloe's house, we poured the contents of the flask down the toilet. Seeing Emily safe, tucked into a clean bed with Chloe monitoring her, was the first real breath I'd taken in months. But there was no time for relief. The most dangerous part was yet to come. That night, I met Detective Miller and two plainclothes tech officers in a darkened van a block away from Emily and Ethan's house. Miller had been tailing Ethan. He was at a downtown sports bar, establishing an alibi and projecting the image of a husband taking a much-needed break. We had a 2-hour window. "The plan is simple," Miller said, her voice a low murmur in the dark van. "We believe he keeps the thallium with his other health supplements. It's a white, crystalline powder. Odorless, looks like salt. Your job is to go in, locate the jar, and swap the contents with this." She handed me a clear plastic bag containing a harmless powder of ground-up milk thistle and other herbs. "The tech team will go with you. They'll place microcameras in the kitchen. We need to see him handle the poison. We need to see him mix it. No mistakes. In and out." My heart hammered against my ribs. I was a 58-year-old man who sold insurance. Now I was about to break into a house to play a part in a sting operation against a serial killer. I took the spare key from my pocket. My hand was slick with sweat. The short walk to the front door felt like miles. I slid the key into the lock, the sound of the tumblers clicking over echoing like a gunshot in the silent street. The house was cold and still, immaculately clean in a way that felt unnatural. It smelled faintly of bleach and something vaguely vegetal, the ghost of 1,000 green smoothies. I led the tech officers straight to the kitchen. While they moved with quiet, professional efficiency, identifying placements for the cameras in a smoke detector and behind a power outlet, I started my search. My hands shook as I opened the pantry. It was a testament to Ethan's obsession. Dozens of glass jars were lined up in perfect, alphabetical rows. Acai, ashwagandha, barley grass, chlorella. It was an arsenal of wellness. I scanned the labels, my breath held tight in my chest. What would he call it? Would it be hidden in plain sight? My eyes landed on a jar near the back, behind a large container of vegan protein powder. The label was simple. Printed from a label maker, Vital Mineral Complex. It was generic, forgettable. Perfect. I pulled it down. Unscrewing the lid, I looked inside. A fine, white powder, exactly as Miller had described. This was it. This was the substance that had stolen Jessica Cole's life and was slowly eating away at my daughter's. It felt profane to even touch it. With shaking hands, I carefully emptied the contents into the evidence bag Miller had given me. Then, I poured the placebo powder into the jar. It looked identical. I screwed the lid back on and placed the jar exactly where I had found it. "We're set," one of the officers whispered from behind me. "Cameras are active. Let's go." We slipped out of the house as quietly as we had entered. Locking the door behind me, I felt a profound shift within myself. The home was no longer just a crime scene, it was now a trap. We had armed it, and now we retreated to the shadows to watch and wait for the spider to return to his web. The following days were a strange purgatory, a blend of heaven and hell. The heaven was at Chloe's house. With every hour that passed without Ethan's poison, a little more of my daughter returned to me. Under Chloe's care, eating real food and the placebo smoothies we made with spinach, fruit, and yogurt, Emily began to heal. The first time she finished a small bowl of soup on her own, I wept with a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight was being lifted from my soul. The grayish tint in her skin receded, replaced by a faint, healthy flush. The fog in her eyes began to clear. She started asking questions, remembering details, her mind slowly stitching itself back together. The hell was the phone calls. Ethan called every evening, and Miller insisted that Emily, with Chloe's coaching, answer them. We would all listen on speakerphone, our bodies tense. The first call, her voice was still weak, and Ethan was a font of saccharine sympathy. "I'm thinking of you every second, my love. Just rest and let the Burlington doctors do their work." By the third day, however, Emily's voice was noticeably stronger. She told him she had walked around the garden. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's wonderful, darling," Ethan said, but the smooth veneer of his voice had a new, tight quality. "Just don't overdo it. You're still very fragile." He was no longer hearing the voice of a dying woman. He was hearing the voice of a failed experiment, and it was making him nervous. The call we were waiting for came on the fourth day. I was at the makeshift command post the police had set up in a commercial building downtown, watching the live feeds from the kitchen cameras with Detective Miller. On the screen, we saw Ethan pacing. He was agitated, running a hand through his hair, a far cry from the serene guru of wellness he pretended to be. He had just gotten off the phone with Emily, who had sounded almost like her old self. His investment was failing to yield its final dividend. We watched, mesmerized, as he walked into the kitchen with a grim purpose. He went to the pantry and took down the jar labeled Vital Mineral Complex. He stared at it, his brow furrowed in deep, analytical thought. He unscrewed the lid and looked at the harmless powder inside, a perplexed scientist examining a faulty variable. He knew something was wrong. The poison wasn't working. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. After scanning the kitchen to ensure he was alone, he walked over to the wall near the refrigerator. He knelt and pressed a section of the baseboard. With a faint click, a small, perfectly concealed panel sprang open. From the dark cavity within, he withdrew a small, heavy plastic bag filled with a familiar white, crystalline powder. It was his reserve supply. This was not a man who had made a one-time mistake, this was a man who planned for contingencies. We watched in silence as he took the jar of placebo powder to the counter, right in the center of the main camera's view. He pulled out a small, precise digital jeweler's scale from a drawer. With the methodical calm of a pharmacist, he carefully weighed out a dose of the thallium. He added the gleaming white crystals to the jar. Mixing them in with the harmless herbs, readying the poison for his wife's return, ready for the next course of treatment. It was the most chilling thing I had ever witnessed, a man meticulously preparing to murder my daughter, displayed in high definition on a 20-inch monitor. "That's it," Miller said, her voice a low, grim whisper into her radio. "We have him. Go." The raid was swift and silent. We watched on the monitors as the tactical team swarmed the house. Ethan was apprehended at the kitchen counter, the jar of freshly mixed poison still in his hand. He looked not terrified, but utterly, incomprehensibly surprised. I watched the interrogation from behind a one-way mirror. Ethan sat at the metal table, his composure returned, looking like a wronged academic. Miller entered and sat opposite him. She didn't speak. She simply turned on a large monitor on the wall, and the footage from the kitchen began to play. We all watched him pace. We watched him open the hidden compartment. We watched him measure death onto a scale. When the footage ended, Miller turned the monitor off, and the room was silent. "Ethan Grant," she said, her voice flat. "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Emily Henderson and the murder of Jessica Cole." I expected denial. I expected a performance of outrage. I was wrong. The mask didn't just slip, he tore it off himself. A slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair, a smug professor about to lecture a particularly slow student. "Deny it," he chuckled, the sound utterly devoid of humanity. "Why would I deny my own genius? You people could never understand the artistry of it." He began to boast. He talked about Jessica first, how her cloying optimism and blind trust had been an invitation. He described how he brilliantly disguised murder as care, how he had doctors, friends, and family all thanking him for his devotion while he slowly poisoned her. He reveled in the power, the godlike control he had over her life and death. "And Emily," he said, his eyes glittering as he looked directly at the one-way mirror, as if he knew I was there. "She was even more perfect. So eager to please, so desperate for someone to save her from her own mediocrity. I gave her a purpose. I made her illness a spiritual journey." He laughed again. "The smoothies, it was poetic. Feeding them death disguised as life, and they drink it down with a grateful smile. It's the ultimate power. And I was this close to succeeding again." He wasn't confessing to a crime. He was taking a victory lap, a monster proudly displaying his work. And I, from the darkness, could only watch, sickened to my core by the true face of the man I had once called family. Ethan's trial was a formality. Faced with the irrefutable video evidence and his own narcissistic confession, his defense crumbled. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a monster locked away where he could harm no one else. But his sentence was only the beginning of my own. My most important task, the one that would define the rest of my life, was earning back Susan's forgiveness. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I found her staying with her sister, and the first time I saw her, the shame was so immense I could barely speak. There were no excuses I could offer, no justification for the monstrous accusation I had leveled against her. All I could do was stand before her, utterly broken, and apologize for my blindness, for my rage, and for shattering the trust we had built over 30 years. It was a painful, agonizing process. Forgiveness didn't come in a single, cinematic moment, but in 100 small, hesitant steps. It came in late-night phone calls, in shared cups of coffee where we said very little, and most of all, in the long hours we spent together at Emily's side, our shared love for our daughter forming a fragile bridge across the chasm my actions had created. Our family had been through a war, and slowly, cautiously, we were learning how to be survivors together. Emily's recovery was long. The thallium had ravaged her body, and the psychological scars ran even deeper. But as her physical strength returned, so did the steel in her spine. Through the legal proceedings, the assets Ethan had stolen from his first victim, Jessica Cole, were awarded to Emily. She inherited the successful IT company, a legacy of another woman's stolen life. Instead of selling it and trying to forget, Emily did something extraordinary. She restructured the company, dedicating a significant portion of its profits to launch a foundation for victims of what she termed medical abuse, a silent, insidious form of domestic violence where a partner, parent, or caregiver slowly harms their loved one under the guise of healthcare. My terrible mistake, my single moment of blind accusation, almost cost me my family. It is a failure I will carry with me always. But now, I have a new purpose. I work for Emily's Foundation. I listen to stories that echo our own, I help families navigate the confusion and denial that I know so well, and I help my daughter turn her profound pain into a beacon of hope for others. I cannot erase the past, but I can help build a future where no one else has to suffer in silence, and in that work, I am finally finding my own redemption.